Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to this fifth of 7 Towards Stockholm+50 Legacy Webinars, the environment and education looking to the future. For those of you joining us today, I'll just point out that while this is the fifth of scheduled webinars, it's actually the fourth one that's live because what is webinar 4 has been postponed until the 12th of May. The theme of today's webinar is a look back as we move towards the future. The event has been organized by Stakeholder Forum for a Sustainable Future in collaboration with ForUM Norway, the civil society unit of the United Nations Environment Program in Nairobi, and with the support of the government of Sweden, the host country of Stockholm+50. I'm Charles Newhan, chairman of Stakeholder Forum for a Sustainable Future, and your host today from New York. I'm joined by our moderator and co-host, Dr. Thomas Macintyre, who joins us from Colombia. For those of you unfamiliar with Stakeholder Forum, it is an international not-for-profit NGO that has, for more than 25 years, been working to advance sustainable development at all levels. Stakeholder Forum seeks to provide a bridge between those who have a stake in sustainable development and the international forums where decisions are made on their behalf. Forgive me for pausing. I needed to start the recording and I forgot to do that, so please forgive me. Now, having said that, we have some housekeeping. Before I hand the floor over to Thomas, I'd like to let you know that the webinar is being recorded and that a link to that recording and a copy of the presentations will be posted on the Towards Stockholm+50 website soon after. Now a bit about how the audience will interact. As you will see, attendee cameras and microphones will be muted as we begin and will remain that way throughout the webinar unless an attendee is invited to participate. Later on in the session, the moderator will invite attendees to speak at various times and will therefore activate their microphones and you can activate your video if you wish to. There will be 5 sessions, including some interactive questions and answer opportunities and an interactive discussion on forward-looking recommendations towards the end. Questions should be submitted to the Q&A window, not to the chat window. We'll monitor the chat window in case some of you forget, and we'll remind you along the course of the event to put your questions in the Q&A window. The chat window is for you to communicate with each other, where you can post links to matters relevant to this webinar topic and to share contact details between yourselves if you wish to. Now, during the interactive session, the moderator will choose questions from the Q&A box for the panel to address, and in some cases invite the questioner to speak, to ask the question, should they wish to, or otherwise interact with the panel. You are welcome to scroll through the questions and upvote them. That is, if you upvote a question, it will help us identify the ones that a number of you are interested in hearing the answer to, and that'll help us deal with answering questions in the time that we have. Apologies in advance if we don't answer all questions in the time because we are limited to just 2 hours. Now, let me introduce today's panel so that we can get started. Professor Daniella Tilbury is an educator, policy expert, and academic leader in sustainable development, credited with having developed the initial frameworks for higher education in this field. She has acted as an advisor to national agencies in Europe, Latin America, and Oceania, as well as traveled extensively in Africa and Asia to evaluate the investment and impact of education for sustainability policies and programs. Daniella is currently the UK government's representative on the UN Economic Commission for Europe on matters relating to education for sustainable development and chaired its presidency event on education at the COP26 UN climate meeting in 2021. She was recently recognized with an honorary fellowship by the University of Cambridge, St. Catherine's College, and a doctor honoris causa by the University of Girona for her contributions to education and sustainability. Thomas Macintyre specializes in the interaction between education and sustainability. He has worked as a research fellow and consultant on UNESCO projects around the themes of sustainability, climate change, and education. Thomas is project leader at the Colombia Foundation Mentes and Transición, promoting transformative and participatory learning amongst grassroots initiatives in the areas of agroecology, food sovereignty, ecotourism, and local sustainable development. Arjen Wals is professor of transformative learning for socio-ecological sustainability at the Wageningen University and Research in Wageningen in the Netherlands, and UNESCO chair for social learning for sustainability. He is also guest professor with the Faculty of Science and Technology at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences and guest professor at the Western Norway University of Applied Sciences. Please welcome Daniella, Thomas, and Arjen. Thomas will deliver the first section of the webinar. So Thomas, I'll now drop off and hand things over to you. I will let you share your screen so that you can then go through this first session. And welcome everyone, and thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Charles. It is a pleasure to be here with you all today. And great that education and the environment is one of the 7 legacy themes for the Stockholm +50. And we're very lucky to be joined by both Daniella and Arjen, who are both heavyweights in this field, where we can all contribute to an engaging and hopefully lively debate around the past, present, and future of education. So for today's agenda, I'll start by providing some background and context to the 1972 Stockholm Conference and some of the important subsequent international agreements on education. After answering some initial warm-up questions as a group about the Stockholm Declaration in terms of the environment and education, Daniella and Arjen will then go more in depth into some of the themes and narratives which have characterized education and the environment over the decades since 1972. We will then move into a general discussion with and between the panelists and you, the participants, facilitated by Arjen. And we will finish with a look into the future of education, and especially the role of the United Nations Environment Programme and other international agencies in helping to attain these forms of education, as well as some recommendations for the future. Let's see. So already in the 1950s and 60s, there were increasingly strong signals that water, soil, and air quality was decreasing, and that this was affecting human health. This was when Rachel Carson wrote the book, The Silent Spring, which has become a metaphor for the environmental movement on the detrimental effects of pesticide use, as well as the Club of Rome in 1972 coming out with the book, Limits to Growth, warning that the Earth's resources would not be able to support the exponential rates of economic growth and population. So with these global environmental pressures growing, Sweden proposed what would become the 1972 United Nations Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm between the 5th and 16th of June with 114 governments, with delegations from 114 governments. The Stockholm Conference was significant. It was the first United Nations conference that focused on the environment, highlighting the finite nature of Earth's resources and the necessity for humanity to safeguard them. The conference provided the first global set of principles for future international cooperation on environmental issues, and in a political context of the Cold War and environmental issues such as pollution, began this new era of global cooperation to search for solutions to reconcile economic development and environmental management, and this paved the way for the concept that we all know about of sustainable development. So in terms of the global principles that were agreed upon in the Stockholm Conference, Principle 19 specifically concerns environmental education. I would like to read out this principle, which was written almost 50 years ago, and this will allow those of you who were around at the time to remember, perhaps be a little bit nostalgic, and then the spring chickens like me, who are not yet born, to try and imagine what it was like being at this conference with all the participating representatives, reaching this general agreement. Okay, so this is the principle. Education and environmental matters. Education and environmental matters for the younger generation, as well as adults, giving due consideration to the underprivileged, is essential in order to broaden the basis for an enlightened opinion and responsible conduct by individuals, enterprises, and communities in protecting and improving the environment in its full human dimension. It is also essential that mass media or communications avoid contributing to the deterioration of the environment, but on the contrary, disseminate information of an educational nature on the need to protect and improve the environment in order to enable man to develop in every respect. So, while the 1972 Stockholm Conference and the Principle 19 placed environmental education on the international table as a means to address global environmental problems, a global framework for environmental education, referred to as the Belgrade Charter, was developed in 1975, which built upon the Stockholm Declaration by adding goals, objectives, and guiding principles of environmental education programs. For example, defining an audience for environmental education, including the general public. The Tilbury Declaration of 1977 updated and clarified both the Stockholm Declaration and the Belgrade Charter by adding new goals, objectives, characteristics, and guiding principles of environmental education. For example, the objectives of promoting awareness, knowledge, attitudes, skills, and participation, as well as positioning education as a continuous lifelong learning process. An important shift was then represented by the Brundtland Report in 1987, which stated that societal problems were not just environmental and ecological in nature, but also have social, cultural, and economic dimensions, such as social inequalities, and this bringing into focus the now ubiquitous concept of sustainable development. In the Rio Declaration, also known as the Earth Summit of 1992, education as a foundation of sustainable development became enshrined and was reaffirmed in the Johannesburg Declaration of 2002, which led to the adoption of the United Nations Decade of Education between 2005 and 2014 to promote sustainable development in education worldwide. This was followed by the United Nations Sustainable Development Summit of 2015, which brought about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, whereby Sustainable Development Goal number 4 is dedicated to quality education, as well as education being recognized as a mechanism to bring about the other 16 goals. In terms of the existential crisis that we're in terms of climate change, I think it's worth finishing this list with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 2021, and specifically the Action for Climate Empowerment, or ACE, which has the goal to empower all members of society to engage in climate action through education, training, public awareness, public participation, public access to information, and international cooperation on these issues. So that was a quick run through, a little background on the context of the 1972 Stockholm Declaration and some of the subsequent international agreements on education. So now, to get our reflective juices running, I would like you to each take a moment to reflect on this 1972 Stockholm Declaration and specifically think about the status and position of education and learning in relation to the environment and sustainability. And as Charles mentioned, we're going to be carrying out a few interactive activities. This is the first one. So I would like to invite you all Charles, if you could add question number 1 to the chat column.
I have, it's there.
Great, okay. So could I then invite you all to click on that link in the chat column, and this will take you to a platform called Slido. And you're going to be asked a question. Since the 1972 Stockholm Declaration, has the status and position of education and learning in relation to the environment and sustainability become weaker, become stronger or weaker in your opinion? And you can do this by clicking on the link. You can either do this on your desktop or your mobile phone. The idea is we're then going to have a little look and see what the different answers are. Okay, so I invite everyone to carry that out. So while the last of you, dear participants, are answering this question, I wonder if there is anyone who would like to share a reason why they consider the status and position becoming stronger or weaker. You can raise your hands on the Zoom function, and Charles will invite you to speak. I see, Charles, that David Benjamin has raised his hand.
Yeah, the reason I think that it has stayed the same or become weaker is because most of the funding activity has gone to research and to implementing climate change mitigation strategies, and not enough money has been spent on education.
Great, thank you very much, Benjamin. Is there anyone else who would like to comment? Perhaps someone who feels that the status and position of education and learning has become stronger? I think, Charles, there are a few people who have raised their hands. Honora Damien?
Yes, I've activated the microphone, but the person has to unmute their microphone to speak.
Hello?
Hello, we can hear you.
Yeah, this is Harrison calling from Cameroon, talking from Cameroon. Yeah, I think that I think it will go stronger because a lot of research has actually been carried out. More technology has improved. You have so many students who are into the research now. As such, the developed world, the developing countries are equally getting more engaged. As such, I think that with all of this and the commitment of other governments, the research has to be stronger. The status on positive education, position on education and learning in relation to the environment has to be more stronger. Thank you.
Thank you, Harrison. So we can see that over half the participants feel that that there has been stronger positioning of education and learning. Although there are some who feel it is turning out weaker. I'm sure that Arjen and Daniella will come back to this table later on. We'll now move on to the second question. Let's see. All right, I hope you can see the screen. The second question is about how our understanding and engagement with the environment has changed over the last 50 years and what this has meant for education. So the same, if you'll see in the chat column, Charles, if you could add the second question, you will be taken to the same platform and you're going to be asked to write down what you consider are 3 new concepts that have emerged over the last 50 years with regards to environment and human-environment relations and the need for these to be included in the revision of the declaration. Could anyone perhaps write in the chat column whether the instructions weren't clear or whether anyone is having any problems accessing the platform and writing in the concepts? Okay, so here there is a wide range of different concepts coming up. Perhaps not surprisingly, sustainability is one of them. Perhaps more surprisingly is the outdoor learning, nature-based solutions. These seem to be the 3 main themes. All right, feel free to continue adding words and concepts to the question. I am now going to pass on the baton to Daniella and Arjen to continue this presentation with the second section labeled Shifting Sands, Education and Learning Since Stockholm. Daniella.
Thanks, Thomas, and thank you to everyone for adding those key words, which are really going to be helping us as we develop this key piece of research to support Stockholm+50 dialogues. It's really important for us to get some feedback from yourselves as to what we're presenting today. But let me start by saying good afternoon and greetings from Gibraltar, which is in the southern Mediterranean part of Europe. If you're here with us today, I guess it means that you recognize the significant role that learning and education can play in advancing environmental goals as well as sustainable development. Why else would you be appealing to a seminar that has the world's education and learning so high up in the agenda? We are going to be doing in the next intervention a brief PowerPoint presentation where we're going to be examining some of the initial entry points findings of a piece of research that Thomas, Arjen, and myself are undertaking into how education and learning has evolved since Stockholm. In fact, Arjen and I will be taking it in turns to review the decades and map how our understanding of the environment, of learning, of education has evolved. And we go back to the roots of Stockholm and pre-Stockholm to understand some of the initial conceptions, but we're also going to try and attempt to understand or explain the context and the shifting narratives or influences that explain how education has been undertaken and why, primarily for the benefit of the planet. Next slide, please. And as we do that, there's a number of considerations that stride right across the different decades. I'm not going to go into the detail of that today. That will all be mapped out in our paper. But I will say that our core interest has been around some headlines, which you will find in white in the slide. So the first headline that we've been examining is how the role of education has been changing through the decades as we try and attempt to support education and learning for the planet or for the environment. So we've seen some patterns, like when we started the education and learning piece, we saw a lot of words, a lot of activities that were focused on informing especially young people and adults about the environment. And then there was a shift towards raising awareness. Then there was a shift again to try and clarify the science and understanding. There was a shift again to providing hands-on experience, and then to learning that helps to reproduce good practice, to shape and influence consumer decisions. And more recently, we find education and learning that seeks to empower, to critique, and to transform. We'll be trying to track these through the decades in a minute. Very quickly, we also have focused on the thematics of education, the key topics, I guess, that have been the focus of educational experiences. So early on, we find that there's a focus on wilderness, on nature, on pollution, progressively to the inclusion of biodiversity, to systems, to energy and climatic change. Then suddenly we start seeing a lot of work on values, ethics, social and environmental justice, the circular economy, and more recently, futures, education, regeneration, and intergenerational rights, appearing more and more strongly under the heading of education for the environment or the planet. The other question we asked ourselves, which we were trying to track through the trends, is where learning happens. So in some instances, we saw patterns and a focus on specialist courses, and then a shift towards optional general courses, and then a shift again to the arts, the RE, languages, to other subjects that were not traditionally associated with the environment, suddenly responding to some of the environmental and sustainability challenges. Quickly, we moved into embedding it across curriculum, the reframing of curriculum, and more recently, we talk about lifelong learning, adult education, whole institutional or whole school approaches, as well as the role of social media in learning for this agenda. So you can see there are shifts that we can track over time. Equally, we study the role of experts and the involvement of stakeholders and how that's shifted over time, the narratives and the paradigms that influence how we perceive education and its role in the environmental, in supporting more positive environmental futures. So again, we can track naturalistic, scientific, critical, feminist approaches, post-colonial approaches, post-feminist, post-human, all these influences that shape the way we go about our learning and education. So we've been tracking some of these and trying to establish how these trends and influences have shaped the way we go about learning in this context. And so we are going to be explaining these decade by decade, and we're going to very quickly move over to Arjen, who is going to kick us off with the decade of the 1970s. But before we do that, could I ask you to use the chat function in particular to just record some reflections and thoughts on some of the issues and key questions that we're raising as we go through the decade analysis. Thank you. Arjen, over to you.
Thank you, Daniella, for kicking this off, this history. And it's a pleasure to be with all of you and to get your input, hopefully, in rethinking the Stockholm Declaration and looking forward to see if we can make more progress in the next 50 years than we have perhaps in the last 50 years. And it's probably urgently needed that we make more progress given the state of the planet today. So in the 1970s, I think it's good to kind of imagine what the world was like back then. It was the time of Sputnik, for instance, the Soviets sending a satellite into orbit, and the rush of the Western world, you might say, to accelerate science education in particular. But also at the same time, as has already been mentioned by Thomas, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and the report of the Club of Rome, but also major incidents like the Cuyahoga River in Ohio, which caught on fire. These were kind of landmark events that led to the raising of consciousness about the severity and the importance of environmental awareness in society and changing our environmental behavior. Environmental education you can locate, I think, in the late 60s when the first journal for environmental education was launched in the United States, and where people like Bill Stepp in particular, and Harold Hungerford and John Dysinger and Arthur Lucas were some of the influences at that time. And you might say, and I should say, that these are mainly Western and white, and often males, that played a big role in this history. And that's also, in a way, our own kind of blinding insights coming, also myself being white and being Western. There would be other influences that we should and will also recognize maybe later on in this presentation. But the focus was very much on awareness raising, on nature education initially, the assumption that we would connect, by connecting with nature, we would be more caring for nature and caring for the environment. At this time, there was a whole basket of instruments or tools for changing environmental behavior, which include technological development and legislation and financial incentives, and education was seen as one instrument that could be used to combat environmental degradation. The location of where the learning took place at that time was mainly in visitor centers, in school gardens, field centers, wilderness areas, and sometimes in environmental education centers that were being formed at that time. Somewhat in primary education and a little bit in secondary education. In higher education, we see at that time the rise of environmental studies and environmental science, which was new at the time, and also can be seen as a form of environmental education, you might say. And next slide, please. So you might say that out of the 60s, we see that policymakers and environmentalists are beginning to see education as a critical instrument in raising environmental awareness, increasing understanding, developing a kind of environmental and ecological literacy that is needed to get people to become more concerned, more aware, more connected to these issues, and eventually also change their behavior. There was an assumed connection between love for nature, developed at an early age, so that would translate to good environmental decision-making later on in life. That correlation turns out to be somewhat problematic. Research has shown since there is often not a direct correlation. And also that there's a first recognition that education in relation to the environment is not just about environmental issues and ecological issues, but they are deeply connected to socioeconomic issues. UNESCO, UNEP, and the IEPP reports and meetings at that time also for environmental education. In Tbilisi, for instance, 1977, were major in shaping environmental education at that time. And I think we move to the 80s now.
Thanks, Arjen. Wow, the 80s. The 80s were a really fascinating time. New energy, new visions for the future, new set of glasses in relation to the environment. So what are we dealing with? Well, with regards to education, we were told at the time that basically we had to look to science and technology to understand environmental problems. There's a very strong focus on that. They had the answers, we were told. You know, science and technology have the answers to our environmental issues. And there was a rather linear and, in my view, a little bit unrealistic approach to how environmental education was adopted sometimes. In particular, when we asked to identify issues and to engage people in problem solving, as if individuals or small groups or even young children could solve the big problems that were facing our world at the time and continue to face our world. But what it did do was very much frame the environmental issues as a scientific problem to be solved. And a lot of that rooting in the science still remains with us today. And of course, we know that science can help us understand the situation, but we more recently have understood that we need a lot more than science if we are going to be addressing the problems fully and adequately. And I'll come to that a little later. The 80s also saw a parallel stream of interest in issues of citizenship and citizenship engagement in issues of environmental and sustainable concerns. So what we see is that the aspect of values and engagement entering the frame of environmental education. So there we're beginning to understand that individual responsibility, the ethos, the culture side, beginning to enter some of the conversations, so that it wasn't just about science, but it begins to shift in the late 1980s to say, what is the right thing to do? What is our responsibility? And the language of responsibility, particularly individual responsibility, filters through a lot of the documentation that we found. What we also find is that NGOs are having an incredible influence on what is taught in schools in particular in the 1980s. There's a lot of interest in specialist courses in the 80s, in the upper education, like in the very late secondary and higher education in particular, while the primary and secondary schools are still looking at, still very much field visits. Sorry, can we go back a slide? Thank you. We're still looking at field visits in the primary and secondary school. And it's very much, again, this idea that we need to expose young children to nature to be able to have strong environmental decision-making in the future that still prevails, something that started in the 70s and continues in the 80s. And also the key aspect of understanding that these contamination, the pollution, the technical issues of environment are not just local, but are becoming more and more global in its understanding and resolution. Next slide, please. And what I'd like to really highlight about the 80s is that the influence on what was taught and what was experienced as a learning situation in the 80s was very much influenced by environmental scientists, NGOs, environmental NGOs, and activists in this agenda. They were pushing messages of urgency, of the need to be responsible, of the needing to understand science. And what we are finding in some of this analysis is that no educational outcomes were being defined. So all the efforts were very much focused on the benefit to the planet. So why are we doing EE? Because we want to benefit the planet. And of course, a lot of the trained educators in schools, the educational professionals in universities, are asking, well, what are the benefits to the learner? You know, what is the learner getting through this experience? We don't just stick issues in the curriculum for the benefit of something else. We need to bring some benefits to the learner. We need to bring some benefits, social educational benefits, as well as other aspects. So then there's a rejection. There's a rejection from some educators who ask, where are the educational frames in this work? And they reject the concept of environmental education or educational learning that is not grounded in particular educational outcomes. And we start seeing a little bit of isolation or a polarization, perhaps, between those who do and those who don't engage with environmental education. Back to you, Arjen.
Thank you, Daniella. So the 1990s, you might call the 1990s as the kind of the birth decade for sustainable development and education for sustainable development. Of course, we have the 92 UNCED Earth Summit in Rio, which has been very instrumental. As a follow-up from the 80s, the Brundtland Commission, Our Common Future, which paved the way in a way for the concept of sustainable development to become more important. And what becomes clear in the 90s is maybe a more integrated, comprehensive view of environment. It's expanded clearly with the socio-economical as well, and the cultural aspect, and also the realization that local and global are deeply intertwined and connected. And that environment and development are kind of twin pillars, although there's also some people who would say that sustainable development in itself is a contradiction, because sustaining is to kind of keep the same and keep going, and to develop is to change. So there are some who'd rather talk about sustainability instead of sustainable development. So there's some debates about this in education, but also in sustainability, what has become known as sustainability science. Also in the 90s is the recognition that the early years, the early childhood education and care is quite critical, and that young children have an innate ability to see things in their relations already and more holistically, but they lose that in a way as they spend more time in schools. So how do we also bring back in our formal education some of these notions of relational ways of thinking, of playfulness and using arts and things like that? They should also be a part of all education, not just for early childhood. What also is quite clear at the time, that there are more critical movements that question notions of economic growth, that call for a rethinking of the economy, and that call for more critical pedagogies that begin to interrogate. And when we talk about influences on the left side, we might also think of people who, like Paulo Freire, who did not maybe have an environmental ecological background, but much more a social liberating approach that would lead to a conscientization and awareness within communities living in poverty who are illiterate and lack the power and in order to improve their livelihoods. So this more emancipatory, democracy-oriented approaches are becoming more important as well. Next slide. So in the 90s, we see the rise of this more critical education, and also the emancipation of the learner becomes important, where we also see more participatory approaches, multi-stakeholder approaches, we might call them today, as expressed in also the local Agenda 21, where community-based learning and education trying to improve local environmental issues that also include issues of justice, social justice, environmental justice are kind of new concepts on the rise in the 90s as well. So it is also looking at both what you might call agency and empowerment of people, while also addressing the more structural issues that make it difficult for people to live more sustainable lives. Back to you, Daniella.
Thanks, Arjen. Next slide is the 2000s, one of my favorite decades. And so what did we learn from the 2000s? Well, a major shift did happen according to the work that we are uncovering, and that's a move away from single actions to change making. So I think those involved in this agenda in learning and education for environment in the context of sustainability in particular, realized that, you know, recycling one item, looking at picking up litter, looking at particular single actions and promoting individual responsibility for those actions was never going to be enough to address the global environmental problems we're facing. So then the narrative shifts to talk about the role of education in change making. So in creating changes socially, in creating changes in the individual, and using pedagogies, as Arjen's just mentioned, that start to critique the way that we see the environment, that start to critique the way we relate to each other, the way that society engages with the natural world. And there's, you know, I guess not just a reflective space for us to change our glasses in the way we see the world, but also the way in which we learn. And so that changes a lot of perspective with regards to the education and learning experiences. We also have new thematics that enter the frame. So we have things like the circular economy, moving away from litter, moving away from recycling. We start talking about a more systemic approach, about understanding where things go to and how things can be reused. And we start talking about donut economics, circular economy. The MacArthur Foundation, for example, has a really important influence in helping us rethink the way we use resources. And of course, that C word enters the everyday vocabulary in that decade, and that's the carbon word. You know, it starts to infiltrate everything. We start talking about carbon compensation. We start talking about carbon miles, carbon footprints, and all of that also influences the way in which we learn and educate for the environment. Marine life becomes a very popular topic in schools as we shift away from the panda effect and the protecting of single species, for example, and the caring for particular relatable animals, to moving to looking at the importance of oceans and the impact of plastics on oceans. It starts entering into a different frame in terms of thematics. But perhaps the real important shift happens in where the education and learning for environment occurs. Because what we see, social learning entering the mix, and that's really important. And we also see, I think we're just skipping slides at the moment. Can we go back? Interdisciplinary investigations. Are we able to go back on the slides?
Danielle, have we lost the share? Because I'm still on the 2010s. Did I go ahead?
Yes, it should be the 2000s.
There we go. Sorry. Thank you.
There we go. So in terms of where the learning happens, it happens in the traditional subjects. It happens in the business schools. So it's a move away from just science and geography to looking at business, looking at other, basically like the embedding of sustainability across the curriculum, which is considered really important. The role of experts and stakeholders begins to shift too. And what we find is that there is a sort of an influence, I guess, from education for sustainable development that is gaining a significant force in this agenda, and shifts not only the glasses and the way we see the environment, the way we relate to the environment, but the way in which we learn for the environment. We stop seeing people as the problem that needs to be fixed or behaviors to be changed, and we start seeing people as agents of change. And I think that's a major, major shift with regards to education and learning. The next slide, please. And this is over to you, Arjen.
Thank you again. Yeah, and there is, of course, these are all interconnected decades, and like the 2010s, they start. I mean, the 2010 is in the middle of, for instance, of the decade of ESD, the UN Decade of Education for Sustainable Development, which started in 2005 and ended in 2014. Which also has played a big and still continues to play in a way a big role in the development of education, environmental and sustainability education across the globe. But when we move to the 2010s, I think it's when also the Sustainable Development Goals are entering, we see a kind of convergence of different planetary educations that have been around, maybe even as early as the 70s: health education, peace education, human rights education, biodiversity education, education related to water, and all these, and environmental education. They all address some planetary issue related to citizenship, health, well-being, good care of the environment, protection of species, and so on and so on. So what happens in the 2010s is that we see these issues as very much interconnected, deeply entangled, and that they require what we might call boundary crossing. They require inter and transdisciplinarity. They require that we see connections, see interdependencies, and that we learn to see ourselves as a part of a system, that we also see that we connect not just with each other, but also with other species. So we also get what you might call post-human perspectives, where we need to kind of decenter the human and become more ecocentric, more biocentric, and less anthropocentric. So these are new kind of perspectives. They have been around for a long time, you might say, historically, but they get more traction in the wider society in the 2010s. There's also the recognition that if we really want to become more sustainable, we need to kind of decolonize our ways of thinking that kind of push for what some people refer to as the commodification of land, of water, of soil, of the air, that makes everything in something that can be traded, that can be quantified, can be exchanged, for which we can put a money value, and we kind of skip the intrinsic value, and we kind of forget that we cannot develop a more sustainable world if we do not learn to think beyond economic thinking towards more inclusive, more relational ways of thinking. I think we skipped another slide and we're now in the 2020s, but that's okay, Daniella. Why don't you just take it from here?
Yes, can we go back to the 2020s? Thank you, Arjen. As you say, these are all interrelated anyway. It's not as if it suddenly stops at the beginning of the decade or starts at the end of the decade. So they're all connected. But when we arrive in the 2020s, within the early years of the decade, it's a very different ball game altogether. In terms of environmental understanding, in terms of the way we engage in learning and education. We're all becoming more and more aware of the reports and high-level statements that bring that urgency now, as we need to change our education systems for social transformation. So the dialogue moves away from individual responsibility and single actions to raise it all above to a level where politicians, leaders, heads of schools, they're all talking and committing to urgent action for the environment at a very principled level. But in parallel, there's a lot of reflection and there's a lot of people pointing fingers and saying we are failing our students as well as our planet. So those two strands of dialogue about the lack of education or inappropriate education and the lack of impact of education on the environment begins to gain strength again. And of course, we get Greta and the Fridays for Climate movement that exemplifies very much how education has failed our young people and continues to fail them. Greta's generation is very right, I guess, in my view, to be angry and to point out that our learning systems, that our educational experiences are helping them understand and become aware of the urgent action needed, but they are not giving them the capabilities, the tools, the experiences that help them make the changes within our societies, within their workplaces, within their homes, so that we can address environmental problems directly. Instead, we have very concerned, very frustrated young people who go to the streets because protest is the only way they think they can have an impact. And that's a very sad predicament on education and learning. So I guess a key message that comes from that is that we must recognize that education, that environmental education, education for sustainability, whatever we decide to call it, climate education, whatever we decide to call the learning that supports the planet positively, it has to be educational. It's going to be transformative. And this is, I think, a point that's missed sometimes as we try to pack it with a lot of climate science, pack it with a lot of facts and figures, with a lot of international understanding, but maybe not enough capability or values clarification or critical thinking skills that will help our young people, our adults, our politicians, our heads of school to bring about the changes that we need to see at that level. So we need education in some that benefits the planet as well as the learner, and that helps to change our education systems. Something that comes through all of this is the fact that the learners and the marginalized have a very small voice in terms of bringing about these educational changes. And so there's a talk of recovery, there's a talk of regenerative education and futures thinking and futures education, which was around very much in the 70s and 80s as a smaller strand of work, suddenly gets a lot of momentum as we talk about intergenerational justice. And I noticed that one of our participants spoke about historical responsibility in answer to one of our questions and the importance of locating environmental concerns in historical responsibility. All of this fits together into looking forward and looking back with this agenda, because they are very much connected if we're going to be advancing learning and education for a more environmental sustainable future. Next slide, please. And I guess one of the key things that we need to address is that education has to be more relevant and more responsive to the interests and needs of young people. And so the word participation is suddenly used a lot in education, but it tends to be token, not always very genuine, in that we still find ourselves in classrooms where the teacher is standing at the front and leading conversations, where there's not enough space for bringing the students' interest outside of the classroom into the classroom, or indeed taking our students to experience the environment and sustainability outdoors and outside of the classroom, even if it's just the school gardens, even if it's just the campus of the university. Experiences external to a system are also very important. We do think that through participation, children and young learners who are the main beneficiaries of our education system are also underrepresented in the design of the education processes and the design of the curriculum. We find that NGOs, scientists have a lot of say in what is taught in schools. And one of the key things that starts to emerge as a thematic in this decade is the need to create spaces to elicit more involvement from our young people, from those marginalized voices as we move forward. Okay, I'd like to move forward with asking Arjen to, next slide please, to take us into a discussion of some of the key things that we have been raising over the last 20 minutes. Over to you, Arjen.
Thank you, Daniella. Yes, this was a lot of information. I think it's very rich history. And again, I feel like apologizing because we haven't really captured everything. We didn't talk about the Earth Charter, for instance, which has also been very important in the development. We didn't talk about people like Kartikaya Sabai from the Center of Environmental Education in India, which has been a very powerful and inspiring source for people, not just in India, but all over the world. Or Miriam Viaya from Brazil and Costa Rica, who's playing a leading role in the Earth Charter, or people like Akpesi Obikwe from Nigeria. So I feel like we must do justice to all these people who we have not mentioned. And I'm sure that there are different people also in the audience today who would probably tell this history a little bit differently and probably would bring in other influencers that should be recognized. So having said that, I think it is good to recognize that we come from different backgrounds, social, culturally, and have different contexts that maybe constrain or enable the integration of environment and sustainability in education in a meaningful way. When we talk about participation and democracy, for instance, the situations are different from country to country, and there are different kinds of local factors that influence the development of environmental and sustainability education. So this we'd like to take these 25 minutes or so to find out from you whether, and there's a lot going on in the chat, and I hope that somebody is monitoring all that, and maybe Thomas, you can pick up some questions or comments that we should maybe pick up on. But the first question we would like to ask you is, how relevant is this analysis to your own experience? What does resonate? Maybe what does maybe something that is contradicting to your experience, or maybe something that might be even missing from our analysis. So if you feel like speaking to that question, you can raise your hand and we can give you the floor. So I'll take a minute or so to just be silent, so to give you an opportunity to think and maybe raise your hand.
Arjen, there are a couple of, there are now 3 hands raised. And what I'll do, with your permission, I'll start bringing them in the order that the hands came up.
Excellent.
Okay, our first participant, Vijay, could you unmute your microphone if you'd like to speak? Vijay Kumar Mapuri.
Yeah, have been working on the environment field for the last 25 years. I educate the postgraduate students on the environment. A lot of things we have seen from the governmental angle and the NGOs and also the local level. What is happening is, until we teach, ask the people for interaction, we get some answers. But going further into the next year or taking forward, when we ask the people who have responded earlier, most of the time we find silence. We don't understand. People, of course, even at very highly educated people, they ignore. Okay, they say that till we talk to them, some conversation, they will respond. But once you are actually asking how much they have achieved on the next year or some time frame, whatever we discuss on, even in the business forums, it doesn't happen. And particularly when we go to the very lower level, like the slums and other areas in India, we incentivize like giving some toffees and some small gifts to the kids. They just take it, forget it. We don't even try to engage further. So the main problem is particularly education from the zero level. That is what we call as our entry level, from upper KG level at least. We should start the curriculum, because unless we start from that age, we will not be able to achieve anything. And particularly at school living conditions, there should be a subject which has to be a mandatory to all disciplines, and then we have to see that they get minimum 50% of the marks, so that they understand the implication of environment in totality. And then further, particularly the other than the science graduates or science stream, people in the arts stream or other streams, they don't understand at all. So we need to have some way to enforce the environment education. Thank you.
Would you like to make a response to that, or shall we move on to the next person with their hand up?
No, I think it's a very good statement, a good discussion point, how to reach people living under challenging circumstances, with under-resourced schools, with very big existential threats, who typically do not have a big ecological footprint, not by choice but by force, how to meaningfully reach those groups in society, and how to maybe take more advantage in a way of these existential challenges. In some ways, there's a whole curriculum. They're immersed in a curriculum which is very powerful potentially, if it can become a starting point for learning and change and transformation. But if within those contexts, the focus is also on, say, cognitive learning and testing and qualification and examination, then that whole rich curriculum of the neighborhood, of the street, is ignored, and they're actually in some ways being distracted from these issues. So there's interesting questions underneath your comments that I think warrant further thought and discussion. So thank you for that.
Daniella, would you like to make any comments on that?
Not at this stage, thank you.
Well, in that case, I'll just invite Gustav Strandines, who is a senior advisor to Stakeholder Forum, has his hand raised. Gustav, if you'd like to address that before we move on to the next guest.
No, I actually have a question, if I may, if that's okay.
Sure, but sure, now that you're on, go ahead, and then we'll move on to the other guests.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this incredible presentation. And just to answer quickly, how relevant is this analysis to my experience? It's 100%. I happened to be in Stockholm back in 1972. I'm also, in addition to lots of other things that I am an educator, educated as a teacher. I have just two quick questions. How much does indigenous knowledge play in your presentation? UNEP was among the first organizations to actually convey a study and assemble indigenous knowledge and put it into their framework a while ago. The other question is concerning sustainable development education versus environment education. You've mentioned this a number of times, and I raised the question because lots of young people have a tendency to say that climate issues, sustainable development, and environmental issues are synonymous concepts. Does this conflate, or does it strengthen the issues, or are we just making an undigested porridge of these issues? Do we need to keep the expertise in sustainable development, and do we need to keep the expertise in environment? And how can they cross-fertilize each other? Thank you.
Well, I think we both have something to say about this one. Which one do you want to pick up, Daniella? The first one or the second one? We can't hear you.
I'm fine with either, Arjen, so you take your pick.
Okay, well, let me just start with the indigenous one then, and then you do this sustainable development, environment, climate, and then the intersection and the relation between them. So to what I mean, I think it's very interesting to see a growing recognition that there are more ways of knowing than scientific ways of knowing. And that includes indigenous ways of knowing and local ways of knowing, local knowledge and indigenous knowledge and experiential knowledge. And that indigenousness is often a part of what we now call regenerative education, where we need to regenerate the kind of wisdom that has been around on this earth, that different groups, different indigenous groups around the globe have developed over a long time, which is much more, you might say, ecocentric or biocentric, less human-centered, and much more in relation to the local environment and much more in tune in some ways with finding a balance than this notion of continuous expansion and growth that we have cultivated in, say, the last 200-300 years in say, the Western quote unquote world. So I think it is more not just recognized in new declarations and intentions and proclamations that indigenous ways of knowing and local knowledge has to become a big part of our education in order to kind of develop more sustainable ways of thinking and doing and acting. So I think it's good to raise it, and it's good to emphasize that this is happening at the moment. Of course, the next question is, how do you do that in practice? One thing is to, and I think this is one of the trends that we see, is that when we focus less on prescribing what young people should learn and how we can define these learning outcomes and test them on an exam, by opening up possibilities for exploration and their own investigations, using all the senses, and also using forms of maybe citizen science, where they begin to monitor and sense their local environment, you in a way are bringing back indigenous ways of knowing, I think. So this is, I think, one pathway that is an interesting one to kind of bridge these different ways of knowing. Daniella?
Yes, I absolutely support what you said, Arjen. Definitely there has been a resurgence, I guess, in terms of incorporating how we come to learn, how we come to know, and that's been challenged by indigenous knowledge previously. But also, I think there's another dimension to this, which is, again, somebody raised this in the presentation earlier, historical responsibility. And these are also related to indigenous knowledge and ways of learning. You know, it ties onto the decolonization agenda. And I think all of these things come together as we become to understand what indigenous knowledge and indigenous ways of knowing is all about. We begin to deconstruct our existing glasses of seeing the world. And so I think this is all tied together in us being on a journey to understand the relationship between people and planet. And there's a lot more investigation and reflection that needs to happen along the way. I don't think we've cracked that aspect yet. But going to your question about sustainability, environmental education, and how it all fits in. Sustainability has an influence on the way environmental education is done, in my view. And equally, we could sort of, if we had to depict the different types of learning that exist at the moment, you could almost capture this in terms of a Venn diagram where you have a circle that captures the diversity of environmental education practices that we can see right across the various educational sectors and in outdoor learning and in social learning. And then there is another circle which is focused on the Sustainable Development Goals, on the Education for Sustainability agenda, which is also very important, and they overlap somewhere in the middle. And so there is an overlap, the overlapping circles where they have some common agendas, some common contents, some common pedagogies, but they're not the same thing in my view. So one thing is not a subset of the other, but there are some overlapping areas in this. So, you know, in this sort of visualization of a Venn diagram. And what are those overlapping areas? I do think the sustainable development continues to challenge environmental education in the way that it understands learning, in the way it understands the environment. Sustainable development does try and bring those connections more closely between environment, economic, social, but also cultural agendas. And the Sustainable Development Goals try to capture that in some way. I also think that sustainable development is challenging environmental education to not just think about nature experiences for the environment. I think environmental education is always focused on outdoor education, connections with nature, as well as dealing with the social environmental problems. But what it hasn't yet come to terms with is how education and environmental education in particular can actually have an impact. Those sorts of questions have not been addressed too profoundly by environmental education yet. There seems to be a linear assumption between we understand the science, we understand the issues, and therefore our responses and our appropriate responses will automatically follow. And I think there isn't enough conversations yet in environmental education about how we involve, engage, empower people to make a change and to make a difference. Whilst I think education for sustainable development is pushing those dialogues much more in that direction. Does that make it clear?
Very much. Thank you so much. It's a long debate, and I would love, you know, hours and weeks and months to engage in that. Thank you so much.
Wonderful.
Folks, we've got two more hands raised, and what I'd like to do is one person has already asked a question, so I'm going to jump to the second person and then back to the other person, if that's okay. So I'm going to, A. Rossi has their hand up. If you'd like to speak, yep, right, go ahead. Thank you.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my name is Ans Rossi. I'm in Brussels. I'm an educational ecologist. Now I can add on a little bit what has been said. Just, I would like to put some questions in the group. what I miss a little bit in the presentation is actually what is the purpose of education in the first place? Because the evolutions that we have seen, it has been very much environmental education has been an add-on to the current professions, the current system. And I think if we talk about transformation, we really need to readdress what is the purpose of education. And I can only talk for the West, but we know the Western model is to prepare for job markets. That's why there is a strong focus on, and each time stronger, and I missed that a little bit in the presentation, on STEM, on the technology, and COVID didn't help in that sense. Digitalization has overtaken a lot of the ideas in how education should be shaped. So this is one for me, really the purpose of what is education for? Why would we educate to become what? And to add on the discussion on all this terminology on climate change, on sustainable development, environment, we have seen the same in corporate social responsibility. There is a whole bunch of terminology that has been passing. What I'm missing is ecology as a concept, because ecology encompasses it all. And ecology is about the relationships that living beings have with each other in ecosystems, and the relationships that living beings have with their environment. So I think language is also important, and we have to sort of capture this encompassing idea that it's all integrated. And with ecology comes the fundamental question, what is our own place as a human being, as human beings, as Homo sapiens on this planet in relationship to the living beings? And I think this is a little bit missing in the presentation so far, and I think this is the next step when we talk to the 2030s maybe to think about. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comment. I think this is very critical. The purpose of education is always a question that needs to be revisited. I think David Orr once said it very well. If you don't reflect on what education strengthens in society and what it weakens, then all it does is will create more effective vandals of the earth. In other words, if education becomes, as you seem to suggest, an extension of the globalizing economy just to serve the market and economic growth, then it does more harm than good. And if you would, that question about have we moved forward in the last 50 years when it comes to education and sustainability, or have we kind of maybe gone backwards? Relatively speaking, you might say that the effort that has gone into, say, entrepreneurial education in the last 50 years has been much greater in terms of resources that has gone into it than, say, in environmental and sustainability education. So I think it's a very good point to look at, as a Dutch education philosopher, Gert Biesta talks about purpose of education in terms of socialization and what are the important social kind of values that we want to cultivate and hand over. Is that one of individualism or competition, or is it one of care and solidarity? That's a fundamental question. And then qualification, the kind of skills, capacities people need to function well, not just in the world of work, but also in their personal lives. And then what he calls subjectification, which has to do with being and becoming. Who do I want to be in the world? Am I allowed to become who I want to be? What's holding me back? What's moving me forward? And your own subjectification as a part of the subjectification of the earth, you might say. If we develop ourselves at the expense of the possibility of the earth and other species to develop themselves, then something is wrong. And this is where I really like your ecological point of view. Because the ecology, as you say, has to do with this relational way of being and the decentering of the human in a way, recognizing that it's not just humans who are exceptional in many ways, but the whole world around us, all species have exceptional qualities, and understanding how, and this corresponds to Jan Gustav's earlier question in a way. I think we have had 200-300 years of an education system after enlightenment, and that's become a Western colonizing system, you might say, where we've learned to make distinctions, and we have learned to reduce the world into smaller pieces and to label people and concepts and box them and draw boundaries around them. And as a result, we have lost the ability to see connections, see relationships, interdependencies. And that's, we need, and we don't have 200-300 years to develop that again. We only have maybe 10 or 20 or 30 to kind of relearn and unlearn at the same time. So that would be my response. And then, and I must say also that I need to be going out of this building is closing. So I'm going to hand it over to Daniella and to Thomas. And I hope that they're looking forward to what's needed for the next, as our last intervener said, what we need to be doing in the next 20, 30 years in order to reorient and education and maybe transition education away from this add-on approach, like you said, towards a more whole system redesign that is that seems to be needed right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Arjen. Thank you. Thank you very much, Arjen, for the contribution today. Charles, may I answer that question as well, please, before we move on?
Yes, go ahead, and then we'll move on to the next question.
So I think your question is so poignant and very direct to the point. And there's two things I'd like to say to that. One of them is thank you for calling us out on it. I think that one of the key things we need to do is evolve the strand that we were looking at that says, what is the role of education? We need to change that to what is the purpose of education and how that's shifted over time. And we need to do a little bit more analytical work on that. Thank you. That's really helpful. Secondly, I'd like to say that for us to move forward, we need to really perhaps reflect on whether education is a mirror or a lighthouse in our society. So a lot of what happens at the moment is that education mirrors the tensions between people and planet. It mirrors the mistakes that we have done in the past and reproduces it through our education systems. It mirrors the structures that are inappropriate for a more sustainable future. And we haven't managed to change them yet. So, you know, schools, universities, outdoor learning areas, they're still very much a mirror in my perspective. And perhaps we need to move towards being lighthouses in the sense that they lighten a new pathway forward towards a more sustainable future, so that we focus not just on understanding the people and planet tensions, but that we create new pathways, new roads, new visions of the future through education. And that's something that I hope is being captured for our presentations as something that is still lacking over the decades. Thank you, Charles.
I'll now invite David Benjamin to speak. David, go ahead, unmute your microphone.
Yeah, I am developing together with an ecologist a physical infrastructure for teaching ecology and sustainable development. It's a physical machine and a piece of software. And I'm having problems finding educators that are willing to co-create this with me, because the environmental education educators that I've been able to find, they're overworked, they don't have enough time, they don't have enough funding, and they're just experiencing fatigue from too much work, so they don't have the time to co-create this this innovation, unfortunately.
If I may respond that to you, absolutely right. And I think COVID-19 has added to the pressures of this on teachers. It really has. I see it on a day-to-day basis. They find it really hard to just get on with their normal business at the moment. So when we talk about innovation, we talk about doing things differently. They may not have the mental space or the energy at present, as they have gone through a rather difficult time in trying to just simply sustain some educational activity for their students. So timing is an issue. But I think if we highlight the educational aims and not just the ecological aims of the work that we're trying to do. I think we will bring more and more educators into the environmental education ring. I think that has been a failing in the past, that we assumed that everybody would be doing learning and education for the benefit of the planet, when a lot of educators, when we've surveyed them, when we've done research, want to do activity for the benefit of the learners and not necessarily for the planet. So we can talk about the duality of learning and the duality of outcomes for the learner and the planet, as well as society. I think we can hopefully move that agenda along. Thank you, David, for the question.
Daniella and Thomas, would you want to consider looking in the Q&A box? There are a number of questions in there. Thomas, I don't know if you've been looking at them and might choose some to answer. At the moment, there are no hands raised.
Perhaps then it is a good moment, Charles, to move on to the last section, so we have also time for discussion.
Okay, that's fine. Let's do that.
Wow, that was a fantastic discussion. Thank you very much, Arjen and Daniella. So much rich material to try and get our heads around. This is then the last section where we're going to think about the future. What we can imagine, what we can envision for the future, and also the recommendations for how we can actually implement the kind of education, the type of learning for better futures. So I'd like to go back to the results of the word cloud that we did. So here we are, and look at some of these main concepts, and also I want to share some of my impressions, some of my things that I've jotted down during this presentation. When I read over the Principle 19, written over 50 years ago, I'm also struck by the fact that it's, and this has also come up in some of the comments from the participants, that it is very human-centric. It's anthropocentric. It's education for human development. And when we look at some of these words, some of these concepts here, we realize that there is much more of a tendency of looking at the interconnected, the holistic view of the economic, the social, the cultural aspects, and how these all come together within our planetary boundaries. I also am struck by this movement towards more transformative education. So the idea of addressing some of the structural barriers that we have for education to really act as a tool for a better world. There's this, is education the solution, or is education part of the problem? To what extent can we expect education and learning to solve our problems? There are other barriers. Poverty is a big topic, also mentioned by some of the participants in the chat, as well as social inequality. There's war, everything that's happening now in Ukraine, climate change, climate refugees, which is unfortunately a phenomenon that's only going to be increasing in the future. So as we think about more transformative, more emancipatory, participatory learning and education, there's also how to reach out, how to support people on the front lines of climate change who have been displaced and do not have the opportunity to go to school and to learn. Another big topic or theme is this movement towards more relational ways of knowing and being. And one of the participants noted the concept of ecology, which is really about moving away from the boxes, from the silos, looking at about the interconnection, the interdependencies between all aspects of life. So last, I'm personally a little bit surprised that the ideas of outdoor learning and nature-based solutions have come out so forcefully here, and I think this is also to do with COVID-19, having to stay at home, less possibilities to leave the house, to be in nature. The emphasis on environmental education, to really to go out in nature, to experience nature, to learn about nature, and therefore to take care of nature. That is a contentious argument, but there's clearly this desire to look at how education can really help us connect physically, experientially with the outdoors, with the world around us. And this, of course, a preoccupation with, as one of the participants noted, with technology taking us away from time outside, away from our families, increasing screen time. And then, of course, I see a new word that's come out now, the Anthropocene, this realization that because of our actions, because of human behavior, we've actually, through our intervention on nature, have created a whole new epocha in our physical and archaeological history. So now, as we all have reflected on these emerging concepts and ideas, and we've listened to Arjen and Daniella talk about the different decades, emerging strands and narratives of education, I would like to invite you all to take a last exercise. Let me see. I can stop share. A last exercise where we're going to explore, or where we're going to share what we consider, if we can envision what we consider education to be in the next couple of years. So I've added now into the chat the question: education in the year 2030 will be characterized by. So I invite you each to copy paste that sentence and to fill it out and to paste your answer in the chat. Then we can read through them and see if there's anything that we can look into and discuss. Is that clear?
Can we also do could be as well as might be, so that we can also have some visionary impact? Is that okay with you, Thomas?
That's short. That's fine. So then, yeah.
I'd like to just jump in and say to our many participants, don't be shy, bashful. Please feel free to enter some thoughts into the chat box.
So I'm already seeing some words like care about each other. I think this is the importance of empathy, being able to put ourselves in the place of other people. This is increasingly important because of political polarization that we're experiencing in society today. It is more and more difficult and we're more and more, the tendency is to close ourselves and our perspectives to those of others. So being able to really open our minds, open our bodies, and to experience different perspectives is definitely a very important capability, skill that we have to learn for the future. The fact that we are interconnected between all species in the world, and that we need to cooperate with one another. We need climate solutions, and we have to include and support and encourage children and youth to get outside, experience the world, and become change agents to make a difference. To increase our respect and our appreciation for the important role of teachers, and to give them the freedom to be able to teach using the pedagogies which they're most comfortable with, compassionate action. And while we talk a lot about more emancipatory thinking, we also need to be working on creating jobs, green jobs that make us happy, that contribute to a greener, more sustainable world. And also, of course, to open up as researchers, as academics, and also as people, to be able to work with different disciplines, work with people with different ideas, with different backgrounds. Very, very important. Because of the time, I'm going to pass over to you, Daniella. If you could put the presentation back on, Charles. Invite you, Daniella, to take over and talk a little bit about the role of the United Nations Environmental Programme and the other international agencies for helping to attain this type of education that we've been talking about, and also to perhaps for you to open up the floor for some feedback, some ideas from the participants in terms of recommendations for this revised Stockholm Declaration.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Thomas. So we've captured in the chat some of your visions for education in the 2030s. So we had to do another slide for the next decade. There's enough material there from your suggestions to try and map what we would like education and learning in support of the environment to be about, and how it is to be undertaken. Thank you for that. I guess what I'd like to do, or what my role is now, is as we bring this webinar to a close, is to actually look at the implications of what we've been discussing this afternoon for the international agencies, for example, UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, and other agencies such as UNESCO, who have responsibility for education and learning. How can we encourage them to help us bring about the shifts that we are looking for to attain this 2030 education that we have defined today? So let me ask the question again. We now have an idea of the vision of what we would like to see in education and learning. The question is, what role should the international agencies such as UNEP be playing in terms of supporting, encouraging, framing the debates, the actions going forward in education and learning, so that we can attain that Vision 2030 for education? Can we please have hands up if you'd like to actually respond to that question in person, or if you very much rather to put the answers in the chat, please could you do so? It's a very important question for the reason that our study, our work, our investigation will need to conclude with very specific recommendations for the United Nations, and particularly the UNEP program. So if you could help us frame those from your expertise, from the dialogue today, that would be really, really helpful. So again, what role could the international agencies, such as UNEP, play as we move forward towards Education 2030 for the environment?
At the moment, there are no raised hands, so perhaps people are thinking about it, putting some comments in the chat box, which of course we'll save, and we will be sharing with everyone. And it will also inform the report that Daniella, Thomas, and Arjen are working on, and the people's narrative that the Towards Stockholm+50 team is going to be putting together. But while we're waiting for raised hands, I'm wondering, Thomas, do you want to take a look through the questions in the Q&A section and maybe choose one or two to address while we're waiting for comments?
Yeah. Can I also, while Thomas does that, provide some examples of the work that agencies have done in the past to sort of help frame the answers? Is that okay?
Absolutely.
So a lot of the international agencies do work on providing guidelines that can be used at the national level by member states to develop policies in education or policies in sustainable development or policies in the environment that have a component of education and learning. So if you'd like that to continue or strengthened in any particular direction, we'd love to hear from you on that. Some of the agencies also work on pilot projects to support particular activities and to look how they can be reproduced or mainstreamed to catalyze change on the ground. So not at the policy level necessarily, but to influence a particular sector or a particular theme or a particular environmental issue. So this pilot projects is the number 2. Other examples may include international collaboration, where various member states come together to develop or advance particular initiatives, perhaps in teacher education or in outdoor learning or in any particular theme you consider to be important. A fourth example could be the establishment of international conferences or summits to raise the profile and status of education and learning in the context of environment as we move forward to 2030. There's a range of tools and catalytic action that an international agency can use to promote this agenda. So very keen to hear from you. These are just some examples. There could be anything really, in which international agencies can support member states and stakeholders in taking this agenda forward.
Thank you, Daniella. There are no raised hands, but there are a lot of comments going into the chat box. So, Thomas, I'll hand it over to you for a moment to see if you want to look at a question that's maybe been upvoted a bit and you might want to pose to Daniella.
Thank you, Charles. I'm looking through the Q&A. There's a lot of comments. I think one of the recurring themes is how to promote education in socially disadvantaged regions and countries where there is poverty, and perhaps where there aren't the resources to invest in education. So a little bit the difference between rich countries and poor countries. How do we really, how can we really support and help countries and regions which don't have the resources to do so?
So we're looking here at recommendations for the international agencies to support, I guess, where there is a lack of resources or investment in this agenda. And I think that that's something that certainly is within the remit of international agencies. I'm also looking at some of the comments that appear in the chat And this talk very much about ensuring we reinforce this type of education at the primary level, at the early years, which are considered to be the formative years. And it is true that a lot of the international agencies haven't yet had the opportunity, I guess, to support work at the very, very early years, the formative years of environmental education. So that could be catalyzed going forward. There's also some comments about engaging with religious and traditional actors as a way to promote a more values and ethical approach to change for the environment. We also have here a call for a shift in paradigms so that we learn to better engage and connect sustainability to the environment. There's comments about working towards empowering stakeholders to take action, and international agencies, again, framing opportunities for that to happen at the member state level. And there's a few more, but I note that Jan Gustav has got his hand up, Charles. Maybe we could stop there for a moment and pass on to Jan and then return.
Yes, Jan Gustav, go ahead.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you, Danielle, and thank you, Thomas. I'll just raise one issue because I think it's important or interesting to me. The UN family often provides and can set the agenda, and we have certainly seen that throughout the years that the United Nations and its many family members have set the agenda in many, many ways. And we also see how history slowly evolves through language, and language has been discussed a couple of times and referred to. For instance, the Stockholm Declaration that you referred to in 1972 talked about the right to nature, a clean nature. And in 1995, the Social Summit in Copenhagen actually changed that language to an entitled to a clean environment. So there is very interesting development here. A few years back, NGO community and a few delegations and the member states of UNEP said we need a special rapporteur on environmental rights. At first, it was thought as something absolutely unnecessary, but it gained force, and we have a special rapporteur on environmental rights and human rights. Would it be of interest? Would it be good? What do you think, Thomas and Daniela, if you had a special rapporteur on environmental education? And it could be an interagency thing so that, that special rapporteur would be forced to draw upon all the elements of the United Nations, but report back to UNEP. Or would that be just another symbolic gesture to say that teachers are important?
Wow, what a question. Clearly reflects your very knowledgeable experience of the UN system by proposing a very interesting way forward, but also at the same time critiquing it. Thank you, Jan Gustav. It's a good question. I think that there's certainly underpinning all of that is the call for more joint up thinking and action, I guess, across the agencies in this agenda. And whether a special rapporteur will do that, or whether we would have to consider maybe a commissioner for education across the UN system in this agenda, like a Secretary General's envoy or commissioner for this agenda that would raise the profile even further, or whether it would be a committee that would work embedded within the system to provide some leadership in this agenda. There's a number of ways in which this could be done, and I don't have the answer, I'm afraid, but we certainly will record that as a possible recommendation as we move forward.
Thomas and Danielle, we are about 5 minutes before the top of the hour. So there's certainly time to answer another question if you wish, but also I think it would be important to give both of you an opportunity for some final comments before we wrap up.
Can I just pick up on an implicit trend that's come up in the chat? And that is the need for UN agencies to have some metrics, some evidence-led decision-making in this agenda to be able to support progress and not just random activities in environmental education. It's come up with the comment just now, but it has been implicit in some of the chat throughout the day. And I think that's a really important point to record. We don't really have any global metrics or evidence tools that can help us collect evidence of progress, that can help us assess whether we're heading in the right direction or not. So as I turn towards the summary of today, it's been really helpful to have your feedback in terms of our current analysis of the progress and advancement of environmental education over the years in Stockholm. We will certainly need to go back to the drawing board and reframe in some cases, expand in others, and look for more greater representation of particular agendas within the work that we're doing. So today has been very helpful for us, in helping us share with you our initial thinking and in having some guidance to refine the final outcome or output of this particular work we're engaged in. One of the key things that I'd like to highlight is the need for us to have more reflective spaces such as this to talk about progress and evolution and not just share good practice. I think there's a tendency in environmental education, education for sustainability, learning for the environment, whatever we decide to call it, learning for climate, to just share examples of good practice. And that's great at one level. But another level, we do need to actually have the space to ask the question, are we headed in the right direction? Are we making progress towards a healthier planet as a result of education and learning? Because that is the core question that was being posed at Stockholm. Stockholm recognized that we needed education and learning as a mechanism, as a platform to advance our goals for a better planet. And so with those words, I'd like to sort of summarize some of the key discussions that have gone on today. Back to you, Charles.
Thank you, Daniella. Thomas, would you like to have some concluding thoughts?
Thank you very much, Charles. And thank you very much for all the participants who have been here with us today. It was a fantastic experience. What I just to kind of build on or to finish off what Daniella was saying is really this idea that we need a transformative education if we are to move towards a more inclusive and sustainable future. And that means there are huge obstacles and paradigms which we have to change. And personally, I think that the best way we can do that is to experience different ways of thinking, different ways of being, to have the courage to meet people who we disagree with in these reflective spaces that Daniella is mentioning. It's so important not to hide away behind our screens in our rooms in our houses, but to actually get outside and experience the world, meet other people, and really try to put into action to make the change that we talk about. And I think that's the big hope for the future, and that's what makes me enthusiastic envisioning the future of education and where we are going towards. There are people, there are organizations that are really putting their heart and soul into this endeavor, and I'm very excited to be part of this. So thank you very much.
Thomas, thank you. I'll just have a few closing remarks before the webinar finishes. One thing I would ask you, Thomas, if you are able to share screenshots or some version of those interactive on the Slido site, where we'll inject them into the PowerPoint presentation that we're going to share with everyone, so they can see, have a historical record of how that was all interacted with our audience. With that, I'd like to say many thanks to all of you around the world for joining us today. and to the Civil Society Unit at the United Nations Environment Program and the government of Sweden for their cooperation and support. And a huge thanks to Daniella, Thomas, and Arjen for delivering today's rich and unique content. And thank you to Jan Gustav for popping in. He has a very unique position in that as a younger man, he was at the original Stockholm Conference, and he brings a very unique perspective to these sorts of proceedings. As I mentioned earlier, the webinar has been recorded, and that recording, the PowerPoint presentation, and the chat content will be sent to you by way of an automated email from the Zoom platform tomorrow. And it'll include a link to the Towards Stockholm +50 events page, where you can download the chat, a PDF version of the PowerPoint, and you can see all of the previous webinar recordings as well. Please join us for those remaining webinars. As you can see on your screen, the next one is tomorrow. And then after that, the 12th of May, and we have one more that we're waiting for a final date on regarding science and the environment. And finally, a short survey will pop up when the webinar ends. Please do take a few moments to complete it. That would be greatly appreciated. It helps us improve what we do for you in the future. And with that, I'll give everyone a chance to say a final goodbye. And we are done for the day. So thank you again, Daniella, Thomas, and Jan Gustav.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.